Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome. I welcome you all to this lecture in the course Sandhi in Paninian Grammar. We continue to study the important part of the Sandhi phenomenon in Sanskrit language, namely Hal Sandhi or consonant Sandhi. Hal Sandhi refers to the Sandhi that substitutes Hal. Hal is a consonant. We have studied that Hal Sandhi can be classified broadly under two heads: Ekasthanika Ekadesha and also Ekasthanika Dvyadesha. Ekasthanika Ekadesha refers to the phenomenon, namely one substituent is substituted or replaced by one substitute, Eka Sthani, Eka Adesha. And Ekasthanika Dvyadesha refers to that phenomenon where one substituent is replaced by two substitutes, Ekasthani Dvi Adesha. Currently we are studying Ekasthanika Ekadesha. We also classified Ekasthanika Ekadesha in accordance with the place of the nimitta or the condition or the environment. It could be Purva Nimittaka Ekasthanika Ekadesha as well as Paranimittaka Ekasthanika Ekadesha. This specific division had to be made mainly because of a peculiar usage of the instrumental case used in Hal Sandhi, and we have already studied two such cases, namely Shchuna and Shtuna. They do not appear in the Ach Sandhi, and therefore even though Ach Sandhi had the Paranimittaka Ekadesha, Ekasthanika Ekadesha, we did not classify it in that particular manner. But in Hal Sandhi we do it, and the main reason is the instrumental case. Currently we are studying Paranimittaka Ekasthanika Ekadesha. Purvanimittaka Ekasthanika Ekadesha was already studied in the previous lectures, especially when we studied the sutras Stoho Shchuna Shchuhu as well as Shtuna Shtuhu, dealing with the Shchutva Sandhi and also the Shtutva Sandhi. Now we are also studying Paranimittaka Ekasthanika Ekadesha, which is diagrammatically represented in this fashion, where you have A followed immediately by B. Both are in the Samhita mode, and so B is the Paranimitta, and when B follows, A gets substituted by C. So this is Paranimitta, this is Ekasthani, and this is Eka Adesha. So Paranimittaka Ekasthanika Ekadesha. This is what we are studying right now. And we are also studying Anuswara Sandhi as well as Parasavarna Sandhi. We have studied this before and we continue in this lecture to study this further. The mainstay of today's lecture is the examples of both these sandhis. But before going there, it is important for us to take a recap of the meaning of these two sandhis and the sutras stating them. Anuswara is being stated by this particular sutra, Monusvaraha. This is the first sutra stating the Anuswara in place of Ma. We have already studied the meaning of this particular sutra. This is 8323. What this sutra means is that immediately before a consonant, Hali, at the end of a pada, Padasya, Ma is substituted, Maha, by an Anuswara, Anusvaraha. We have already studied in this connection what is a pada. Pada is being defined by Panini in the Sutra 1414. The sutra is Suptingantam Padam. What it means is Subanta and Tinganta. These are the padas, and Ma coming at the end of a Subanta or Ma coming at the end of the Tinganta is substituted by an Anuswara if this Ma is followed by a Hal. So, the example of Ma coming at the end of a Subanta is Ramam, and this is Ma coming at the end of a Subanta. Is the Sup, and so this Ramam has got at the end, so this is a Subanta. Similarly, Apatam, and once again you have Ma coming at the end of Tinganta, this is a Tinganta, is the Ting, and so this is a Tinganta. And so now when this Ma is followed by Hal, it will be substituted by an Anuswara, and the output would be Anuswara plus Hal. The example is visible over here. We have Subantam and Tingantam written in this particular fashion where no Hal is following. Subantam, that's all, and there is no Hal following. Tingantam, no Hal is following. So Ma is written as a consonant Ma with the proper signs of indicating that it is a consonant. But once this Ma or this Ma is followed by a consonant, for example over here, Pa is a consonant, and so this Ma at the end of Tingantam is substituted by an Anuswara, Suptingantam Padam. This sutra itself is an example of Monusvaraha. And then after this Anuswara, substitution takes place. The sutra Anuswarasya Yai Parasavaranaha applies. This is 8458, and it has got three padas, Anuswarasya, Yai and Parasavaranaha. Anuswarasya is 6-1 of Anuswara, which means in place of an Anuswara. Yai is 7-1 of Yai. Yai means all consonants minus H, Sh, Sh and S. And Parasavaranaha is 1/1 of Parasavarana. Parasavaranaha means the substitute, Parasavarana. So this sutra means immediately before Yai, that is all consonants minus H, Sh, Sh and S, substitute an Anuswara by a sound that is homogeneous of the latter, that is Yai. I repeat, immediately before Yai, all consonants minus H, Sh, Sh, S, this is Yai. So immediately before Yai, substitute an Anuswara by a sound that is homogeneous of the latter sound, that is Yai. This is an example. So if you have an Anuswara followed by Yai, this Anuswara will be substituted by a Parasavarana, Parasavarana plus Yai. So this has to be Savarana with Yai, but we must note that this parasavarna is replacing an anuswara, which is a nasal sound. So, the most close substitution in place of this anuswara would be the nasal parasavarna, that is nasal and parasavarna of yai. So, that is why this first rule is rewritten in this particular fashion. So, anuswara plus yai is the input, 8458 applies, and the output generated is nasal parasavarna plus yai. This sutra takes the anuswara as an input and generates nasal parasavarna as the output. Now, arrangement of rules in the Ashtadhyayi in this particular section, namely Asiddha section, is in accordance with this input-output scheme, which then means that the output of 8458 cannot become the input for any previous sutra, and therefore we can generate forms like kurvanti, which evade the retroflex, which comes at 84 and 1. So, the output of 8458 is not visible to 841, and so there is no retroflex, and we get the form kurvanti and similar such forms derived by the Paninian grammar. We also stated that there is one more sutra stating optionality. In the previous examples, the anuswara followed by yai, this was happening within a pada, let us say. When the anuswara is at the end of a pada, followed by yai, which is at the beginning of the next pada, then this nasal parasavarna substitution is optionally done, which means that optionally you will also have the same input being generated as the output. So, vapadantasya means immediately before yai, and yai means all consonants minus h, sh, sh and s. Substitute an anuswara that appears at the end of a pada by a sound that is homogeneous of the latter, that is yai, optionally. I repeat, immediately before yai, substitute an anuswara that appears at the end of a pada by a sound that is homogeneous of the latter optionally. Do this optionally. So, anuswara coming at the end of this pada followed by yai coming at the beginning of this pada, this being the input, the output generated by the application of 8459 is the nasal parasavarna, which substitutes the anuswara plus yai, or optionally the same, that is anuswara at the end of this pada plus yai at the beginning of the second pada. Both these outputs are generated by 8459. After having re-looked at the sutras, which are the core part of the anuswara and parasavarna sandhi, let us now study the examples. First, let us study the examples where ma comes at the end of a pada and is substituted by an anuswara, and then this anuswara is substituted by the parasavarna. So, for example, here we have sam plus hasati, where ma comes at the end of a pada. Sam is a preverb and upasarga in Paninian grammar is considered as a separate pada, and so this ma comes at the end of a separate pada, followed by hasati, at the beginning of which comes a consonant h. So, we have sam hasati. Now, this ma will be substituted by an anuswara as an output. So, we have sam hasati. This will be the output generated by 8323, sam hasati. Now, since h is not part of yai, there is no parasavarna substitution taking place of this anuswara. So, sam hasati remains sam hasati. Then we have sam yatate. All these examples of ma coming at the end of a pada are taken of the preverb sam or upasarga sam. So sam plus yatate, and here comes at the beginning of this pada, so this is hal, and so now this ma will be substituted by an anuswara like this, sam, which is an anuswara, sam yatate. Now because this is a yai, this anuswara will be substituted by the nasal parasavarna. The nasal parasavarna of ya is anunasika ya, sai plus yatate. So sam yatate will then become the input for anuswarasya yai parasavarnaha 8458 and also vapadantasya, because this is anuswara is at the end of a pada. So vapadantasya 8459, and the output generated would be sai yatate. This is one output, and the second output optionally would be the same, sam yatate. Similar is the case with sam plus vartate. Ma at the end of a pada followed by a consonant va. So this ma gets substituted by an anuswara by the application of 8323, and you get the output sam vartate. Then 8459 applies and substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna, that is nasal va. So we have sound and vartate, and this is optionally done. So we also have sam and vartate. Both these forms are generated, sam vartate and sam vartate. Then we have sam plus lupyate. Once again ma at the end of a pada followed by a consonant hal, and so 8323 applies and substitutes this ma by an anuswara, sam and lupyate. And then vapadantasya 8459 applies and substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna optionally. So you have san lupyate and optionally also sam lupyate. So both these forms will be generated by vapadantasya. Similarly, we have sam plus ranadhi. Ma at the end of a pada, ra at the beginning of this second pada. Ra is a hal, and so 8323 applies and substitutes this ma by an anuswara. So we have sam and ranadhi, and so this will be the output. Since ra does not have a nasal variety, there wouldn't be any further substitution process taking place over here. So there is no substitution. You don't substitute this anuswara by ina, because ina could be the parasavarna, comes very close, but that does not happen because ra does not have a nasal variety. Now we are following the order stated in the Pratyahara Sutras. We have looked at examples where the second pada begins with ha, ya, va and ra so far. We continue following the same order of consonants presented in the Pratyahara Sutras. So the next consonant is ya. There isn't a particular word in Sanskrit beginning with ya. However, there is one pada which is the past perfect form of the verbal root mu. This is what is presented over here, sam plus yunguve. And because ya is a hal, so ma is substituted by an anuswara, sam yunguve, and then 8459 vapadantasya applies and substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna, that is ya. So you have sai yunguve. Then we have sam plus manyate, ma at the end of a pada followed by another hal, So this m is then substituted by an anuswara. After the application of 8323, we get some manyate as the output, and then 8459 applies and substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarana of m, which is sam. So we have sam plus manyate optionally, and then we also have some manyate. Similarly, we have sam plus ngavate as the input, where ma appears at the end of a pada, and so 8323 applies and substitutes this ma appearing at the end of a pada by an anuswara. So we get sang plus ngavate as the output. Later on, this anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarana of ng, which is ng itself, and so we get the output sang plus ngavate. Then we have sam plus nakariyati, and here also m gets substituted by an anuswara by the application of 8323, and so we have sam nakariyati, and then this anuswara gets substituted by the nasal parasavarana by the sutra 8459, and so we get the output in the form of san and nakariyati, san nakariyati. Finally, we have sam plus namati. So ma is substituted by an anuswara by the application of 8323, and so we get sam namati as the output, and then by the application of 8459, this anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarana, which in this case is na. So we have san and namati. Then we have sam plus jhashati, and ma is substituted by an anuswara by the application of 8323, and the output generated is sam plus jhashati, and 8459 applies over here, and the output generated is sai plus jhashati, and optionally also sam plus jhashati. Then we have sam plus bhinatti as the input, and so this ma coming at the end of a pada is substituted by this anuswara by the application of 8323, and so the output generated is sam bhinatti. Here 8459 applies and substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarana of bh, which is ma. So we have sam plus bhinatti. This is optional form, so we also get sam, which is anuswara, and bhinatti as an optional output. Then we have sam plus ghaghati, ma coming at the end of a pada followed by a consonant. So 8323 applies and substitutes ma by an anuswara. So we get the output in the form of sam and ghaghati. This becomes an input for the application of 8459 vapadantasya, which then substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarana of gha, which is ng, and so the output is sang plus ghaghati. This is optional, and so sam plus ghaghati also is generated as the output of 8459. Then we have sam plus dhaukate. 8323 applies and substitutes ma by an anuswara, sam and dhaukate. Now this becomes an input for 8459, and that rule substitutes this anuswara by na, which is the nasal parasavarana. So we get sandhaukate as the output. This is optional. So we also get sam and dhaukate as an optional output. Then we have sam plus dhavati, and this ma at the end of a pada followed by a consonant is substituted by the application of 8323 by an anuswara, sam and dhavati, that is the output generated, which becomes an input for 8459 to apply, and 8459 substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna of dha, that is na. So we have sandhavati. This is optional, so we get sam and dhavati. Similarly, we have sam plus jayati, and the output generated is sam and jayati by the application of 8323, and this becomes an input for 8459, and so this anuswara gets substituted by the nasal parasavarna of this ja, which is ya, sai jayati. This is optional, so we also get sam jayati as the optional output. Then we have sam plus badati, and ma is substituted by an anuswara by the application of 8323, and the output generated is sam plus badati. This becomes an input for 8459, which substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna of ba, which is ma. So we have sam plus badati as the output of 8459. This is optional, so optionally we also get sam plus badati. Then we have sam plus girati. This sam has ma at the end of a pada followed by a consonant. So 8323 applies and substitutes ma at the end of a pada by an anuswara. So you have sam and girati. Now this becomes an input for 8459 to apply vapadantasya, and that substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna of ga, which is nga. So we have the output sang plus girati, and that is optional. So we also get sam and girati as the output. Then we have sam plus damati, and this ma is substituted by an anuswara sam damati. This becomes an input for vapadantasya 8459, which substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna of d, which is na. So we have san damati as the output. This is optional, so optionally we also generate sam damati as the output. Next we have sam plus dishati, and ma at the end of this pada followed by a hal is substituted by an anuswara. So we have sam dishati generated as the output of 8323. This becomes an input for 8459 vapadantasya, and then 8459 substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna of d, which is na, and so we have san plus dishati as the output generated. Remember, this is an optional output, so optionally we also get sam and dishati. Similarly, we have sam plus khanati, and the output generated is sam khanati, where ma is substituted by an anuswara. This becomes an input for 8459, and this anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarna of kha, which is nga, sang plus khanati, but this is optional, so optionally we also generate sam plus khanati as the output. Similarly, sam plus phanati. Once again, this ma is substituted by anuswara, and so we get the output sam phanati. This becomes an input for 8459, and the output generated is sam plus phanati optionally, and so optionally we also get sam plus phanati. Similarly, we have sam plus chinatti, and ma is substituted by an anuswara, and the output generated is sam plus chinatti. This becomes an input for 8459, and so 8459 substitutes this anuswara by the nasal parasavarna of cha, which is ya. So we get sai plus chinatti as the output optionally, and optionally we also derive sam plus chinatti. Then we have sam plus thakkati, and ma is substituted by an anuswara by 8323, and this output is generated. This becomes an input for 8459, and then this anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarna of tha, which is na. So we have san thakkati, that is the optional output generated. Similarly, sam plus tharvati is the input and ma is substituted by anuswara by 8323, and so this is the output generated, which becomes an input for 8459, and so this anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarana of th, which is na. So we have san plus tharvati. Remember, this is an optional derivation, so we also have sam plus tharvati as the optionally derived forms. Finally, we have sam plus chinoti, and this is an input. 8323 applies and the output generated is sam plus chinoti. This becomes an input for 8459 and the output generated is sai plus chinoti. Remember, this is an optional output, so sam plus chinoti is also generated as the optional output. Then we have sam plus tepate, and this is an input. 8323 applies and the output generated is sam plus tepate. This becomes an input for 8459 and the output generated is the nasal parasavarana of t, which is na. So we have san plus tepate, and optionally we also have sam plus tepate, this particular as output. Then we have sam plus tanoti, and this input is processed by 8323 and the output generated is sam plus tanoti. This becomes an input for 8459 and the output generated of this sam especially is the nasal parasavarana of t, which is na. So we have san plus tanoti as the output. This is optional, so optionally we also have the same over here, sam plus tanoti. Then we have sam plus karoti, and this becomes an input for 8323 and the output generated is sam plus karoti. This becomes an input for 8459 and the output generated is the parasavarana of k, nasal parasavarana of k, which is ng, sang karoti. And this is optional, so we have the form sang karoti also. Then we have lastly sam plus pibati, and this becomes an input for 8323 and the output generated is sam plus pibati, this anuswara. This becomes an input for 8459 and the output generated is sam plus pibati, which is the nasal parasavarana of p, and the optional form will also be sam plus pibati. The examples that we looked at just now contained ma coming at the end of a pada, which was always a preverb. Here are some other examples where ma comes at the end of a subanta and it becomes an anuswara. So we have harim and vande, where ma comes at the end of this subanta followed by a halva. 8323 applies and we have anuswara substitution over here, harim and vande, and because this va comes in the pratyahara yai, so then 8459 also will apply optionally, and so this anuswara will be optionally substituted by the nasal parasavarana of va, which is va. So we have harim vande and the optional generated output would be harim vande. Similarly, we have gramam gachami, and this ma coming at the end of a subanta pada then is substituted by an anuswara over here, and this becomes an input for 8459 to apply, and this anuswara gets substituted by the nasal parasavarana of g, which is ng. So we have gramam gachami, but this is optional, so we also have gramam gachami. Similarly, yanam chalati is the input, ma is substituted by an anuswara, yanam chalati, and then this becomes an input for 8459, and so this anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarana of ch, which is ya. So we have yanai chalati. Then we also have shlokam tankate. Shlokam tankate. This is an input for 8323 and the output generated is Shlokam Tankate with an Anuswara, and 8323 has generated this output which becomes an input for 8459, and so this Anuswara is substituted by the nasal parasavarna of T, which is Zina, so Shlokan Tankate, but this is optional, and so the other optional form generated is Shlokam Tankate. That is the optionally generated output. The observation as far as the examples that we have studied so far is this: R does not have a nasal variety and hence Parasavarna will not substitute the Anuswara when R follows. This is clearly stated as far as the Vyakaran Mahabhashya is concerned, and also with various formulations in the later Paninian grammatical tradition. Ha is also not part of Yai, so Parasavarna will not substitute the Anuswara when Ha follows. Now in this particular lecture, we have studied examples where Ma comes at the end of a Pada. There are some more examples where Ma comes at the end of an internal Pada, and then of course Ma and Na coming in between the Pada. This we shall study in the coming lecture. Thank you very much.